It sounds like he and his mother are very enmeshed and that she might be using him kind of as a surrogate husband. I say this because you're being treated like the other woman.
Hey everybody, before we start the show, I want to make a couple disclaimers. This show does cover a wide variety of topics related to mental health and life in general, and some of those could be sensitive for you. I want to simultaneously encourage you to be brave in consuming difficult content, but also respect and recognize your limitations. So please use your best judgment. I will never be offended if you need to skip a question or an episode entirely, but feel free to feel it out, check out the episode, and just see what happens. If you need to skip, that's okay, but feel free to give it a shot first. I also need to say that while I am a psychologist, I'm not your psychologist, and I'm not your therapist. This is not intended to be direct medical advice, and you should not use this as a substitute for professional help. So with those said, let's go ahead and get into the show.
All right. Hello, friends of all varieties. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast, episode 354. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff, aka Duff the Psych. I make mental health content for real people just like you. And today we have a question and answer episode. Both of these questions are basically about dating, relationships, that sort of thing. So awesome questions. I'm happy to share them. If you would like to send me a question for the show, please shoot me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com or use the contact form on my website at duffthepsych.com. And yeah, I think this should be a pretty, nice and tight, relatively short episode. But before getting into it, since these are both about dating, I wanted to remind you guys that I have my most recent, little mini book out. It's 500 questions for dating, relationships, romance, and more. If you just search for 500 questions for dating on Amazon, it'll pop up. It's a cheap book. It's thin, it fits in your pocket, and it has a lot of great questions in there that you can use to, explore on your own or to give you potential things to ask about on a date or even when you're breaking the ice on a dating app or something like that. So I want to read you a few out of here. I'll read one from each section. So I have basically different levels of questions. Level 1, which are icebreakers. Level 2, which are a little bit deeper. Questions about sex and, intimacy. Serious relationship questions, and then some quotes. So let me read you one from each, and I'll just kind of flip to a random one and read it out. So let's see here. Number 79. This is like an icebreaker question. I was reading the question. You'll see what my flub was. So number 79 is, what would you love to have a lifetime supply of? That's a good question. Money doesn't count. You can't say money. I would probably pick wine, honestly, just so that I don't ever have to go buy it, because I really do love my wine. That sounds terrible. I'm sorry. But yeah, I stand by it. Okay, so that's a level 1 question, an icebreaker, easy sort of thing. Let's do number 119, which is a level 2 question, so a little bit deeper here. 119 would be, what do you know about your parents' upbringing? And as a bonus one, I'll look over to the other side of the page, and number 132 is, are you easily embarrassed? How do you feel about being embarrassed in general? So kind of interesting questions there. Let's go to a sexy time question. Number 21 is a pretty intense one. What do you worry about being judged for regarding sex? That's definitely one that I think you would have to know somebody pretty well to ask, but it's a very good question, if I do say so myself. And let's pick a serious relationship question. Number 19, how do you take accountability when you've done something wrong? And then let's pick a quote. Let's see. Number 45 is by Brené Brown. Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves even when we risk disappointing others. Great quote. So yeah, it's, if you go to my website, all of my stuff is on there. If you just search Robert Duff on Amazon, all of my books are on there. But this one I feel like is a sleeper hit. There's so many good things in here. I've definitely brought it with me, to dates. I've definitely brought it out when I've had people over just to talk about the topics and stuff. So I've gotten a lot of personal use out of it, and I think you would too. But that said, why don't we just go ahead and jump into the questions? Here's the first one. It reads, hello, so I have a question. I'm going into the online dating pool to find a relationship, not just a hookup anymore. I've been diagnosed with BPD, which is borderline personality disorder. I also have depression, anxiety, and ADHD. Those three don't worry me. It's the BPD that gives me pause because of the misconceptions perpetuated in the media and the history I've read about in books. I'm stable on medication and will be entering therapy when I have the money. How do I broach the subject and when, and how do I explain it? I don't want to feel like I'm hiding something from him or him to feel like I was hiding it. It's just the stigma that gets me. I've had some promising dates. I feel like I should tell them immediately in case it's a deal breaker. That way there's no broken heart. But I don't know. I'm lost. Thank you for the question. This is a really good one. I think that many people with BPD or similar issues have struggled with this idea, so I appreciate you asking it. There's no one specific answer to this question, and in practice, people with BPD handle this in many different ways. So first thing I need to be clear about is that your mental health status is your own personal healthcare information. Nobody has a right to it unless you're comfortable sharing it with them, assuming that you're an adult and we're not talking about your parents or something. But, of course, in the dating world, nobody has a right to this information unless you want to share it with them. Since we're talking about BPD, borderline, it's highly likely that it will impact interpersonal relationships in some way. Just as a reminder, if you're not familiar, BPD or borderline personality disorder is a personality disorder that manifests as a tendency to have intense and unstable emotions, impulsivity, and a fragile sense of self. And it often causes people to have intense fears of abandonment and difficulty regulating their emotions. So you can often see very volatile relationships, a sort of boom and bust pattern where people alternate between idealizing somebody, connecting with them at a deep level very quickly, and then devaluing them when they feel that they've been slighted or they feel like they are not being treated well, that they're on the verge of being abandoned. And there's a lot of this sort of push and pull where somebody with BPD might act out in ways because they're afraid of being abandoned, which will in turn drive somebody away, which sort of proves their point. And they're like, see, I've been abandoned again. So it can be very tough sometimes for certain people, and it does have a lot to do with the relationships. It's very related to interpersonal interaction. So in some cases, providing information about your symptoms or diagnosis to a partner can be helpful in avoiding misunderstandings and clarifying things that transpire within a relationship, right? So if something happened and you need to help them understand why it happened so they don't interpret the wrong way, that can be valuable. But you're right, there are a ton of misconceptions about BPD, and these paint people as hopeless when it comes to having, solid relationships. It paints them as volatile or scary or dangerous in some way. And it's a shame. In reality, everybody with BPD presents differently. You take two people with the disorder, they may have some similarities, but they're not going to be exactly the same. There are also many people that live successfully in the context of the disorder. And it's much more treatable than you would think. It's much more treatable than the media or common wisdom would have you believe. I mean, even to this day, if I talk about, that I work with somebody who has BPD and I'm talking to a colleague, depending on who it is, they might be like, oh, wow, like instantly. So, just be aware that there is this common understanding of it that doesn't necessarily line up to the real experience of it or what the research says. That said, it is for sure a much more difficult disorder to treat in many cases than something like just mild depression or anxiety, but those media depictions are definitely overblown. So I'm glad that you have this awareness of it. And in general, it sounds like you have a lot of self-awareness, which is very, very helpful in a situation like this. One way of thinking about this is to consider how you might approach things if you had a physical chronic illness instead. So say something like multiple sclerosis. So a physical health disorder that's progressive, and MS is something that would potentially impact your relationship in the future in some sort of way. But if you had MS, does it make sense to show up on the first date and just throw it out there, tell them that you have MS so that they understand what they're getting themselves into? I don't know. I think people are going to have different approaches about that as well. But in general, I personally don't feel like you have to throw out all of your personal healthcare information right off the bat. Especially in the early stages, you're just getting to know somebody and you're trying to figure out if you're compatible as two humans. And you're both going to have shit that you're coming to the situation with. So it's totally normal to let things develop a bit before airing all of that out. Now, if you do wind up being in a long-term committed relationship with a person, I assume you're probably going to want to share some information about your BPD at some point. But in some cases, doing so very early would create the risk of somebody not really understanding what you mean And those misconceptions could lead to a rupture in the relationship. That's not your fault. It would be, ignorance on their fault or something like that. But you want to be aware of that and careful about that. Now, aside from the diagnosis itself, right, aside from saying, hey, I have borderline personality disorder, it could be helpful to bring up anything that is relevant in a more symptom-focused sort of way. So if BPD is a really big bomb to drop at that point in the relationship, you can instead say something like, hey, so remember last weekend when I kind of had an anxious freak out and I kept texting you over and over and over? I'm sorry about that. And I hope that we can be okay. I have some mental health quirks that I'm working through and I'm in therapy for, and it just plays tricks on me. Sometimes I feel like I'm being abandoned when I'm not. And I totally recognize you weren't doing anything wrong by being with your friends. So I wanted to apologize and help you understand where that came from, because I don't want you to think it's something between us that's going wrong. I just sort of found myself in that state. So now you know what's going on with me, right? So just talking about it in a more abstract way, focusing on what actually happened rather than saying, hey, I have this. To me, it's also similar to like if somebody were to say, hey, I'm autistic. What does that mean, right? That can mean something different for many different people. And if you just throw that out there, a lot of people might be like, oh, wow, okay. I have all these assumptions about what that means for you, for us, for the possibilities here. And those may or may not be accurate. I don't know if this example that I provided about the anxious freak out for feeling abandoned would apply to your presentation, but it's just one example of how you can talk about things without labeling yourself and providing more information than you need to. If it does come to a point where you want to share fully about your diagnosis, I think this would also provide an interesting chance to judge the character of the person that you're dating, right? It can teach you about how open-minded they are, whether they give you the benefit of the doubt, and whether they're willing and interested to learn more about what you're dealing with before making assumptions about it. I think that you can certainly give them resources or help them understand, but you shouldn't need to educate them from the ground up if they actually care about you. They may be coming from a place of ignorance, not understanding anything about it, but that should be something that prompts them to learn more before they make those assumptions. So again, how they react to whatever you throw out there at whatever point you do, that can teach you something about them. And before I continue talking about the other parts of this question, I want to take a quick break and talk about today's sponsor. All right, this episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. So if you are out there and you are also getting out into the dating pool and you need some help interpreting things that happen, dealing with rejection or disappointments, or dealing with the anxiety of upcoming dates, you may benefit from some therapy. It's a great place to process feelings like this. And while we're focused a lot on other people when we're doing the dating thing, focusing on yourself is something that can be very, very beneficial as well. So if you're thinking about getting some therapy, you should check out BetterHelp. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire, and that'll get you matched with a licensed therapist. And if you need to, you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So find more perspective and balance with BetterHelp. Go to betterhelp.com/duff today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/duff for 10% off. Let's get back to the question here. You asked about the lying and honesty component, feeling like you're lying about something. That's really not how I see this. As I said, it's your healthcare information. And inevitably, in a relationship, you're going to learn more about each other as things progress. But that doesn't mean that you are withholding or hiding things from the start. That's just sort of how it works. And you may consider that there very well may be a parallel situation with somebody that you're seeing that you wouldn't know. So, for example, perhaps the person that you're seeing has significant trauma from childhood abuse, and you don't find out about it from the start. It's not something that he just throws out there at the first date, and you don't find out about it until it becomes relevant, right? They don't want to talk about it on dates. They don't bring it up unbidden, and they maybe don't trust everyone with that information until they get to know them. So think about how you would feel in a situation like that, right? So maybe you had a situation where your date reacted in a way that was unexpected and maybe a bit emotional. And so you were wondering what's going on. And they told you that the reason for it is that they have a history of childhood trauma. And they just haven't told you about it yet because it's uncomfortable. And they wanted to make you aware so that you could understand why they acted that way, why things were happening. But it was, say, 4 or 5 months down the line. Would that be offensive to you? Would you be upset and think that they were withholding things from you or lying? My guess is you probably wouldn't, and you're holding yourself to a different standard, but that's just a guess. So think about that, right? We all have things that we keep to ourselves until it's relevant, or we have things that we keep to ourselves until we trust somebody with it. And not everybody has a right to all of this sort of information from the start. And you're not lying to hold on to your own private information until it's relevant. So in summary, you don't have to spill all the information right away when dating. You can if you want to. You're certainly allowed to just throw it out there and see how they react, but you don't have to. And when you do explain some of it, you don't have to be entirely specific and use all the terminology. You could be more general and keep it to the situation. And I think that somebody's reaction to you explaining more about yourself and your mental health would also be helpful in learning more about them as a person. Before wrapping up here, I also want to take a moment to congratulate you. I think you're doing a really good job. You have a number of different psychiatric difficulties, and it sounds like you've been working hard at coping with them. And you're stable on medication, seeking out therapy. That's great. So to me, I think that that's a good thing in the dating prospect. It's very attractive, personally for me, very attractive to see somebody who is having that self-awareness and trying to work on themselves. None of us are perfect, and it shows that you give a shit and you're trying to do the best you can to take care of yourself. And I think that's awesome. Your BPD is not the most important thing about you. It's one facet among many. And I think that in this context, you're really going to be fine. Don't forget as well, guys are trash sometimes. And just because one person might have a bad reaction, that doesn't mean that it's your fault. And it doesn't mean that you need to make generalizations. Every situation is different, and you're not broken because of this. It's very easy to scapegoat yourself or your BPD, but you're going to experience the normal wins and disappointments related to dating regardless. And that doesn't necessarily have to be about that BPD. So again, I think you're in great shape. Best of luck, and thank you for the really good question. All right, let's just roll on to question 2. It reads, "Hi, Dr. Duff. Your podcast is great. It's been very helpful. I even started therapy for the first time because of it." Let me pause and say that's fucking awesome. Thank you. I love getting feedback like this and hearing that this prompted somebody to take, what they heard about on the show even further and get some professional help. That's great. Continuing on with the question. I'm from Colombia, by the way. Here's my question. 4 months ago, I started a relationship. He's 28, I'm 25, and we're very happy. The only problem is he has a very close relationship with his mother. They live together. I live by myself. He spends a lot of time with me, but he's always worried his mom will get mad. He constantly says he should leave and spend time with her. He's told me that every time he tells her he's coming to see me, she gets angry. I've never had to worry about including a mother-in-law in my previous relationships, but in this case, sometimes we have to take her into account in many of our plans. I notice he also feels pressured. I would even say he acts more out of guilt than love. How do you think I should approach this? Thank you for the question. This is a tough one, and I've definitely seen people in similar situations. You mentioned that you're from Colombia, so obviously there's a lot of potential culture that's tied into what's going on with this question. I know that a lot of people from Mexico, Central America, South America have very different styles with regard to parent-child relationships than you might see in the United States. Obviously, with any culture, we need to be careful about overgeneralizing, but traditionally in some of these more patriarchal societies, especially if there's a lot of religion involved, there can be a high value placed on men. And there's sometimes this sense of them being very doted upon by their mothers, very enmeshed, very close, and sometimes even a little spoiled. So, yeah, again, we need to be careful about generalizations, even with the family and societal culture like that. There's variability. So it can be hard to draw that line. I'm assuming you're both from Colombia, so you're aware of this, but it's still a concern of yours. So it can be hard to draw that line between what's normal and what's a problematic amount of enmeshment between son and mom. In this case, what you're describing does seem to be a little bit of an unhealthy version of this because it's getting in the way. It sounds like he and his mother are very enmeshed and that she might be using him kind of as a surrogate husband. I say this because you're being treated like the other woman, right? In air quotes, the other woman. And she seems to be jealous that he's spending time with you and not her, that she thinks it's his responsibility to provide for her emotional needs. He's nearly 30. I can understand a little bit more if maybe he was 18 or 19 and there was still some of this kind of Oedipal dependency, but he's nearly 30. So this is getting to be a bit much when she's relying on him for her emotional needs. That isn't his responsibility. He can love her and care about her and be an integral part of her life, but that sort of guilt and anger and things like that, that tends to be a sign that it's not quite healthy. I really think, though, this truly comes down to what you want and what you're okay with in your own relationship, right? You can understand that some of this is cultural, or this is just the way things always have been in this family. It's an existing pattern. But what it comes down to is whether you want that or not, whether you're okay with that. Do you want this for yourself? I'm getting the sense that you're trying to be understanding, but you're really not okay with this. And that's all right. You don't have to be. You don't have to want this sort of relationship where it's contingent upon the feelings of his mother. That doesn't have to feel good or fair to you. So what I would advise is to be honest with him. Say that you understand that he loves his mom and this is how their relationship is, but it's not what you want out of a relationship. And you need to ask him to be honest as well about, is this what he wants? Does he want this kind of relationship with his mom? Is he happy with that? If so, then take that information for what it is. Maybe it won't work out between you guys. Or maybe it will and you can adapt and that's something that you can grow to appreciate. But, in all likelihood, it sounds like if that were the case and he was completely content with the way his relationship with his mother is, you wouldn't work out too well. But if he wants his relationship with his mother to change, if he can recognize that it's problematic and he's like, yeah, I know this is bad, she needs help, or, we need to figure something else out, I need better boundaries, then you can start to have conversations about that. You can have conversations about boundary setting and about what you want your relationship to look like and see if there's actually a roadmap to get there. And you can tell him how it makes you feel, right? You can say that you don't want to feel like his mom's always going to be prioritized over you. You don't want to feel like you're stealing him away from her or that you're doing something wrong by being with him, because you're not. And, you can also let him know that he cares about you, but it's not about the feeling as much as it is the action that he takes and that sort of guilt-driven behavior that you talked about on his side in terms of feeling guilty toward his mother. So yeah, I really think that honesty and those conversations would be important. I would also advise you to be careful about pursuing a relationship with somebody and then expecting them to change. That's a mistake a lot of people make and then regret later on, where they go into a relationship and say, oh, well, there's some potential here. They'll probably change. They'll grow out of this, or once we get more serious, this will be different. You can't count on that, right? Unless you're actively working toward it and communicating about it. You don't want to have that regret later on. So unless he can recognize where you're coming from and commit to changing, I would not expect it to change. And then, there are some creative solutions here as well, right? If the goal isn't to block out his mom and have these harsh boundaries, maybe you guys can be more creative and say, okay, well, we don't need to consider her in all of our plans, but maybe we could grease the gears a little bit by, having you work to earn more of her trust by interacting with her more or doing things that make her feel secure so it's not as much of a concern for her. Sort of taking an empathetic approach, like what is her fear here? Her fear is that she's going to lose her son or her companion, her, confidant, whatever he is to her. So is there some way to make her more comfortable with the idea of your relationship? Again, you don't have to. This is something just to consider. You can also just say, hey, this isn't going to work for me. I don't want that. You need to be your own man. And I don't want somebody who is, just on the leash with their mom. That's okay too. In the end, this isn't on you. You're allowed to have your concerns about this, and he's allowed to have whatever relationship with his mom that he wants. But if you're going to work out together, you're going to need to come to some understanding, and maybe he's going to need to make some changes to his life that are consistent with building a healthy relationship with you. And I could give him the same exact advice in reverse, right? If he's feeling like you don't value his relationship with his mom or the family part as much, then on his side, he also needs to be aware of whether he's okay with that or not. And then, of course, have those conversations with you. So as with many, many, many relationship scenarios, communicate about it, talk about it, figure out where you guys stand. And that's about it. Pretty straightforward in terms of the response, but I hope this was helpful. You're not being oversensitive here. This is a valid thing to be concerned about. And if you go online and search my boyfriend is too close to his mom, you're going to find just oodles of things out there. Did I say oodles? What the fuck? Sorry. You're going to find tons of things out there that describe similar situations. You're not alone in it. And there's a lot of good advice out there as well. I just think that, really be real with yourself about what you want, what you're okay with and not. Talk about it and just try to move forward from there. So thank you for that. And with that, that's the end of this episode. Like I said, short and sweet. Episode 354 of the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. If you want to find the show notes, go to duffthepsych.com/episode 354. And if you want to send me a question for a future episode, send it to duffthepsych@gmail.com. All right, guys, take really, really good care of yourselves, and I will see you for the next episode. Bye.